Okay, we're going to talk about exceptions in Java. So I'm creating a new Java project, exception test, exception test, and this project is going to have a main method, a new class I'm going to create, Java class com.example.exception demo. Okay, test one for example. So in this class, I'm going to demonstrate you what are the different types of exceptions and what actually this exception is and why we should care and what is going to be like merit of an exception and what is going to be a demerit of an exception. We'll discuss about that. So by the word exception, when we hear this word exception, what comes into our mind is something exceptional has occurred. Okay, something which is not expected that has happened. Suppose you want to add a number by another number. Okay, you are expecting the result to be some value, but something happens like while performing this operation, addition operation, or while performing the equals assignment operator, some sort of execution of the code, something happens which is not expected. In that point of time, we say that an exception has occurred. So users should understand, users should know that this exception is either this exception is good or bad, or should I be worried about this exception or not. So such exceptional situations when happen in Java, we broadly divide them into two types. Okay, broadly divide into two types. One exception is like checked exception. Another one is unchecked exception. Okay, so what is checked and unchecked? Again, like this exception is divided into two parts. One is checked exception, one is unchecked exception. By exception, we mean that whenever there is some exceptional behavior, some sort of exceptional thing which has happened in our flow of execution in our code, the flow of execution is going to be stopped. Okay, so if you have written statement 1 semicolon, statement 2, statement 3, like that, if you have written some 5 or 10 statements, suppose you have 5 statements, at statement number 2 there is some exception, then 3, 4 and 5 are going to be skipped. Like the exception has occurred and it's not better to go ahead and execute the next statement. So what Java will do, whenever there is some exception, it will stop execution at that point of time and it will try to return back to the caller who has actually called that exception, called that method or that block of code. Now the exceptions, there are different types of exception. One is a checked exception or a compile time exception. Compile time exception. Another is unchecked exception. This is a runtime exception. So basically during runtime, if there is some exception which is happening, then we call it a runtime exception. Okay, the user has no idea what the exception is, or the user doesn't tell the compiler that this exception is about to come. But checked exception is like the compiler will always tell you to handle that exception. If something goes wrong, you are going to handle it. Checked exceptions are something which are needed, which are mandatory to be handled while writing the code. Okay, let me give you some example. If you are trying to access a file, in one of the previous examples we have already seen, like we were trying to read a file, read the contents of a file, or we're trying to write something into the file. At that point of time, the file is an operating system resource. Okay, there may be a situation I have written the name of the file wrong, so the file will not be available at runtime, because while writing the code I may not be sure what the file name is going to be. The compiler is not worried about name of file, but while running the code the compiler needs that file to be present in the system in that directory. If the file is not present, there is an exception. This is an exception situation. The compiler is not going to execute the next statement, rather it will return back to the person who has called it. So let's try to look at one of the file exceptions that we just talked about. To open a file in read mode, like if we want to read a file, we give this command file. This is a class in Java. We need to import it from java.io package. I have created the file I've taken the file type, file, then say for example, simple file. This is the reference name equals to new file. When I say control space, it is asking for a file name, that is by calling the constructor. This is a parameterized constructor. So I'm giving the file name over here. Okay, now you can see like I have created a new reference and I have not given any file name. Test. Let's say for example the name of the file is test or names.txt. This is a valid file now. But the thing is that, is there anywhere this file present? Okay, is there anywhere this file is present or not? While I am trying to access this file by reading some data from file, so this file reference is there, I am trying to read some data from file. So I'll use file input stream. Again, this is from java.io package. Okay, file input stream, FIS, file input stream equal to new file input stream. And it is taking the file object. See, this file object is being used over here. And while I'm writing the code, you can see there is some red mark below this constructor. This constructor is showing some red mark. So while I'm trying to call the constructor, it is showing me some compilation error. In Eclipse, when you see some red mark, or when you say some red mark on the left side or some red mark just below the statement, it says that there is some compilation error. So my file is not getting compiled. Now what is the reason of this? If we put our mouse on this, it is going to say us that there is one exception, unhandled exception. An exception is there which needs to be handled during compilation time. That exception is called as file not found exception. So this is some name given to a specific type of exception. Okay. So it says that when if the file is not found, this exception is going to be thrown. So they have already told you anything, if some exception has occurred, if I write anything else, and if the exception has occurred, it is not going to go to the next line. So I have written file open for reading. At the end, I am going to write some logic to read from file. And at the end, I am going to close the file because the operating system wants all its resources to be closed before exiting the code, before exiting the application. I am going to call the file.close method. And you can again see there is one more exception over here which say again like it's a compilation error. If we put our mouse on that, it says IO exception needs to be handled. Because the file is something which may be closed or may not be closed at some point of time. Maybe while reading the contents of the file at some point of time, when it reaches over here, the execution reaches over here, the file is locked by the operating system, or the file is deleted, or the file is being used by some other application. So it is not possible to close the file if it is being utilized by some other resource, or it is being locked by some other resource, or the file is deleted. So these are the two scenarios, two exceptional situations which stops the compilation to happen. So these are the exceptions which are being checked during compilation process. So that's the reason it is called checked exception or compile time exception. So if I try to run the code, it is not going to run because there are two errors in my code, right? There are two errors in my code. So there is one way we can do which says that if this exception comes, then just go back. So if there is an exception over here, that is if this name.txt file is not found, this line is going to throw some exception and rest of the code are not going to be used. To get that thing done, if we want to do that, then we can throw that exception out from here. So it says there are two options, like throws exception. It is asking if we click on this throws exception, it will automatically throw any error if it is getting not all the error. If this file not found error is happening, exception is coming, then it will throw that exception from here. So if you click on that, you can see there is some change in the method's body. In the arguments after that, there is written throws file not found exception. It says that within this method, if something goes wrong, and if that error, that exception is file not found exception, then stop execution from there and come back to the caller. But still the code is not complete. There is still some error, some exception over here. This compilation error. So if you put our mouse, again it is going to ask for two things, are throws declaration or surround with try catch. We'll discuss about try catch, but before that let's click on throws exception. Now two different types of exception has come. One is file not found exception and second one is IO exception. In Java inheritance, if we refer to the super class, then all the child classes are indirectly referred by that. So if you look at the file not found exception, that is actually a subclass of IO exception. So it is not good to have file not found exception and IO exception at the same time. Java will automatically convert them into the super exception. So now I have IO exception throws. That means if file not found exception comes or if IO exception comes, it is going to automatically return from that line of code. And I am going to write sysout the file operation complete. Now I am going to run the file. Run this Java code. Right click, run as Java application. See, the file is not present. And we have got some exception. The exception says exception in thread main java.io.file not found exception. It says that name.txt no such file or directory. It says that there is no such file which is existing in the project class path or project build path. It's not existing in the file system. So that means that my project is not having a file with the name. If we look at the compiler, it says that names.txt. So let's do one thing. Let's create this file. Right click, copy. Let's create a file with this name. I'm going to go to the project's home. This is the project's home directory. Within that, I'm creating a new Java file. New, just a simple general file. And I'm giving the name as names.txt. And I'm selecting exception test. Within that, this file is going to be created. Finish. Now that file is created. Now I have some data written in the file. If you write the data, it's not mandatory to write or have some content in the file, but it's mandatory to have the file present in this project's class path or project's base path. Now let's do one thing. Let's run the code again and let's see what happens. Right click, run as Java application. This time there won't be any error because the file is present. It says that file opened for reading. So if you look at the last time when I tried to run the code, this line has executed. This line was trying to execute but it failed. File not found exception has happened. Rest of the lines were skipped. They were not executed. Now the file is there, so the file object is created and it is able to read the file. Input stream object is being created. After running this line of code, executing this line of code, it is now ready to execute the second line. So it has printed file open for reading. Similarly, try to close the file. It has been done, and at the end it is trying to print something. So this line is also executed. So this is how basically the exceptions they affect our code, and this one is an example of a compile time exception or a checked exception. There are different exceptions. I have already talked about checked and unchecked, or we call them compile time exception. Unchecked are runtime exception. So we have already seen what is a compile time exception, which needs to be handled by at the time of compilation. Otherwise, the code will not run. First of all, the code will not compile because it is having some compile time exception. Now we have seen what a compile time exception is. Let's go and check a runtime exception. Now runtime exception is something when the code execution is happening. Okay, when the code execution is happening and it comes to a situation which was not earlier known by the application. Now while writing the code, I know that there is a chance that this file is not present. And this file input stream, it says, it insists that we need to handle that exception. Either we'll throw it back or we'll handle it by using try catch block. We'll use try catch just a moment after. But right now, we have an idea that this file may be present, may not be present. So I have to explicitly write throws IO exception. But there are situations when the compiler doesn't know that this is going to happen, or that happens during runtime. Okay, so let's take one example of runtime exception. So this we have already seen, reading and writing, reading from file. So now let's give one more example which demonstrates about runtime exception. Okay, let's do one thing. Let's go to a new class, Java class, and say test2. In this test2, we are going to talk about runtime exceptions. So I'm going to have a main method, and in the main method, suppose I am having a string name equal to some value. Fine, now the string is having some data, and if I try to make uppercase value of it, if I want to print the upper value, so I'll write name dot to uppercase. So it is going to print my name in uppercase. After that, if I want to display a message that I am done. Now if I try to run the code, it will first execute this line, then it will try to execute this line, and after that it will try to execute this line, and then it is done. So let's run this code, run as Java application, save the file. Now it says, in capital letter, the name variable's value is printed in uppercase, and after that this line is also printed, I am done is printed. Fine. Now what happens, suppose this name object is basically not initialized, it's not having any value. Understood? It's not having any value. So it says during compilation itself that the name is not initialized. Okay, the local variable may not have been initialized. I've just created a string name, but this variable is not initialized. So it is a syntax error which says us to initialize some data. How do we initialize? How do we assign some value? By giving this equals operator and some data in this. Suppose somebody wants to give a null. Okay, somebody just gave the value a null. Okay, now this null is basically no memory location. There is no string object, there is nothing. But over here I am trying to call a method to uppercase. Okay, this method is trying to be called by the main method. Main method wants to call to uppercase method on a string object. It thinks that this name is basically pointing to a string object. But after executing this line, the name is pointing to nothing. So if we try to execute, if we try to call a method on nothing, then it is going to give us some error. So that happens at runtime. Suppose initially I had some value. Okay. Later on, I have put some logic. Suppose I have given some if condition. If this condition is checked, okay. If this condition is checked, like, so for example, if it boolean, okay, let's give it, let's take a better example. If the system's current time is greater than 10 p.m. okay, now dot get if this is greater than, hour of the day is greater than, in 24-hour format it's going to be 10 p.m. that is 12 plus 10, that is 22. If current time is greater than 10 p.m. or 22 hours, then let's do one thing. Let's set the name value equals to null. Okay. So if this is the logic in some application, then after executing the first line, name is having some value. Sysout name equals to plus name. The name is having some value. But when it is executing this line, as it is greater than 10 o'clock, I am having the logic to make name equals to null. So after executing this line, the name is pointing to nothing. And I am trying to execute, I am trying to call a method to uppercase on the name variable or the name reference where it is pointing to nothing. So here we are going to get an exceptional situation. So let's run the code. Right click, run as Java application. Okay. The condition is not satisfied. Okay, the time is 22 hours and some minutes. Okay, so that's the reason why it is not failing. We're going to make it greater than 11 o'clock. We are not greater than 11 right now. So let's run this code again, and you can see what happened. 10:50. Let's print the time. Let's see what the value is. Now dot get calendar dot hour of day. It says the hour of day is 22. We need to make it less than or equal to. If it is less than or equal to 22, or let's have this condition, if it is equal to 22, if the hour is 10 o'clock and some value. So this is the condition which needs to be satisfied. Suppose we have given this condition, if it is 10 o'clock and some value, I don't know, but at least 10 hour of the day is 10 o'clock, then we are going to get some error. Or if the hour of day is greater than and equals to 10 o'clock, then this condition is satisfied and the value of name is becoming null. Now let's run this code, Java application. And here you can see the first value name equals to the value of name. This is printed. Okay, now the next line is calendar get instance. It has executed this line. While setting the value of null, let's give some error message. Just give some meaningful message, not error message. The time is greater than 10 p.m. Setting name to null. Okay, so when this condition is satisfied, it is going to say us that the time is greater than 10 p.m. So setting the name to null, and the name value is set to null, and then we are going to get this error. Right click, run as Java application. And you can see the first line is executed. While executing the second line, after that it has set the value of name to null. And if you look at this error, it says that there is a null pointer exception. There is a null pointer exception. That means we are trying to access a memory reference which is basically pointing to a null location. Null location as in there is no object present actually. We are just trying to point to an empty space, and we are trying to execute some two uppercase method on that empty space, so this error has occurred. So how do you know that this error has occurred at line number 21? We can know that by looking at the, okay, over here you can see the class name is there, test2.java, and line number 21. You can directly click on this, it will take you to that line number. Okay, any doubt till now? Guys, are you with me?
Yes.
Okay, so no doubt. Sanya, is it fine? Okay, great. So we have seen how these checked exceptions are compulsory to be handled, and unchecked exceptions, they can happen at any point of time which the code is never aware of. Suppose at this point of time there is some file error and my application is going to stop from here, right? When the application is trying to execute this line, it stopped and it could not do anything else. But what I want is when the application is going to stop, before that, if some exception is happening, before that I just need to tell the user, but there is something wrong which has happened. The user is not going to get these red color messages. The user is not going to understand anything from null pointer exception. We are Java developers, we understand how the code is written and what is the meaning of each of these messages. But when the end user is trying to access, we cannot show them these things. So we need to understand when such exception has occurred, then we can tell the user, boss, this is the thing which is wrong, right? Suppose I want to handle the situation when some file not found exception is happening. So I'm going to write try. So this is a block. Typically every block in Java looks very similar. If it is a for loop, it's a for block, then we have some syntax, and this is the block. If it's a while loop, we have this syntax. If it's a for if condition, then we have if. Similarly, if it's a try block, it is going to look like this. So within this try block, we're going to tell to the compiler something may happen wrong, like something wrong may happen within these two blocks. Okay, these two lines of code. So what wrong can happen? So we're going to put the code which are expected to fail. So these are the code which may fail, because we have already seen this file input stream is actually throwing some IO exception or some runtime exception, or not runtime, some sort of checked exception like file not found exception. Okay, so what is happening? This line is throwing some exception, and I want to understand when this thing has happened. I need to write some logic. I need to handle that situation, to handle or to catch the exception from stopping our code from execution. I can write catch and give these two brackets and the catch block. Within these two brackets, I can write whichever error, whichever exception we are basically interested in. We want to know if the file is not present. For that, Java has told us file not found exception is about to come. So we can write file not found exception, and if you want to complete it, use control and space. It says file not found exception. Double click or press enter and you can give it a name. So now this is the class, this is a class, and this is the reference. So we are handling file not found exception, and we're going to tell the file, which file? Names.txt does not exist. Fine. That is the reason why this exception has occurred. And next, if I want to handle the next exception, while closing the file, there is some error, some exception from the operating system. I just want to address it to the user that if some sort of exception is occurring while closing the file, that is IO exception, I need to handle that as well. So I need to tell the user that I couldn't close the file, I'm sorry for that, catch, and I'm going to write which exception? IO exception. Because we have seen on file close, this IO exception has occurred. So let's do one thing, let's 1 second. So when you see if there is no handling of this exception, IO exception, it says that there is some error. If we put our mouse on that, it is going to ask for 4 different options. It says add throws declaration, which we have already done. It will throws IO exception on the main method. Or we can use add catch clause to the surrounding try. It says this is the surrounding try, and we are going to add another catch block. We can either write it manually or we can put our mouse on that and click on the second option. It's going to add the catch block for us. Click on that and you can see the exception is handled automatically. Java has done this for us. This is a comment. If we don't need it, we can delete this line. And this is the this is some automatically like method which is being called on this IO exception class, that is e.print stack trace. It is going to give us some information which is again very much confusing. So we can remove that and we can now write our own logic. We can say that error occurred while closing the file. Fine. Now this is the way how we can handle this exception. And see, while we have taken these catch blocks, there is no need to give the throws command. Okay, the throws keyword is not needed anymore because I am manually handling everything using the try block, which basically takes in all the code which may have some exception. And while having some exception, if we face some exception in the code, we need to handle it. We need to tell Java this is the only exception I am talking about, and the body to write my own logic. Similarly, this is the exception I am talking about and this is the body. So whenever there is some exception within this try block, if that exception matches with any of these catch blocks, it is going to move to that location. So when we say this names file is not present and it is in this line, it is going to throw some exception and the code is going to break from here. The code is not going to go back to main method. The code is rather going to look for the corresponding catch blocks. It is file not found exception. You can see throws file not found exception. So it will look for file not found exception. Yes, it has received that. So after executing this line, if this file is not found, it is not going to break and go back. Rather, after executing this line, it will come to the corresponding catch block. So this line, this body will be executed. If this is fine, if this is there, so it will execute this line, then it will print file open for reading, then it will try to close the file. If there is some exception in this line, so it is going to see which exception? IO exception. It is going to look for IO exception. It searched for IO exception. No, this is not IO exception. This body won't be executed. Is this IO exception? Yes, this is IO exception, and this body is executed. So let's run this code. Right click, run as Java application. See, the file is present, so we are not getting any error. This block is executed properly. And when this block is executed, none of the catch blocks are executed. Okay, so let's do one thing. Let's name it a different name.txt. Okay, we're expecting the program to have name.txt, but we don't have such a file. We have names.txt. So if we try to run this code, it is going to throw which exception? File not found exception. And you can see there is no red mark and everything. It's just a message that we have written. It says the file name.txt does not exist. So the code has failed in this line and it has come to the corresponding catch block. This is the file not found exception catch block, and it has tried to execute this block of code. And after executing this, it's again not going back, it is coming to the next line of execution. Okay, any doubt till now?
Sir,
Mm-hmm.
so every time if we use catch block,
Hmm.
we should have to use file not found exception and IO exception always.
Yes, if you are talking about file reading operation or file writing operation, these are the two compulsory exceptions that we are going to get. Because the Java file API is written in this manner that Java wants to tell you if the file is not present, then Java will throw this exception. Then you need to handle this because this is a checked exception. Okay.
So when we use try and catch block, so
If you are trying to read a file, then you will use this. If you are doing some sort of operation, there may be certain cases where the exception may occur, and we need to handle that. Otherwise, you can see if you don't have any try catch blocks, all our code are going to be wasted. They are not going to be executed. Suppose at the end I want to just tell the user that the file operation is complete or goodbye. But when the file, this exception has occurred, the code will go back from here, go back, and we are never going to tell the user goodbye. We are never going to greet the user. That is a problem. So this is the reason why we have these exceptions to handle. You need to understand actually why this thing happened. We need to tell user you have done something wrong, or the user has not put the file in that proper location. So that is the reason we have these exceptions in picture.
so the exception handling and throw the exception handling same works well, because if we throw some exception, the red line must block the sentence.
Okay, suppose you want to tell the user when the file is not present, suppose the user's name is Sanya. So you want to tell user, hi Sanya, the file name.txt doesn't exist. So can you write that without using this try catch block? If you say throws, it is not going to be executed. So this is for the user to write his own logic. Suppose the user wants to print something and the user wants to save something into the database, the user wants to send a mail or put some logic over there that this file is not present. So this location is available for user to write his own logic. Understood? So if the file is not found, it is going to tell you what? Hi Sanya, the file is not present. See what the error is. Hi Sanya, the file does not exist. But if you write throws exception, throws file not found or IO exception, okay, and if you don't have this try, you said now this both the things are same. Just look at the output. Now they're different. You have the same code, same logic and everything, but you have not handled the code. It is going to give you some error. You barely, it is hard to understand. And when you tell your user, if Sanya doesn't understand Java, okay, she just wants to look at the console. This is the point of contact. Okay, from this point the Sanya is going to understand what happened wrong. She is going to get all this information which is not needed. because she's not a developer. She doesn't need to understand the exception. She just needs to understand the message, why this thing happened. Understood? So that's the reason why we handle the exceptions. Okay, anything else, Anya? Understood? Okay, fine. Okay, there is one more keyword which is finally. Finally says that even if the exception has occurred or even if it has not occurred, there are certain part of the code which are always going to be executed. Suppose you have you have started writing something into file, or you have opened a file, you are doing some operation on that. So your application is consuming some memory from system. If your application crashes, that memory location may not be freed. Okay, that memory location may not be freed at that point of time. So closing the file is very much important. So closing the file is very much important, even if this part is executed properly or there is some error, but closing the file is very much important. So the code that we have seen just some times back, this is the code. In this code, if the file is not present, so we're creating this reference, trying to create this one, but we're getting some error. This line is not executed and the FIS file input stream.close has not also happened. Okay, so we want to close the file at any point of time if the file is not closed. To do that, we are going to take this reference out and we're trying to assign see, there is no difference in this, right? We have created a reference, we have assigned it null, but later on we know that while trying to create the file input stream object, while trying to create the object by calling the constructor, at that point of time I may get this file not found exception. So I have put just that much of code in the try catch block. Okay, and I have just closed the file over here, so I'm not closing it right here. I'm going to write finally, it's another block, and over here I'm going to search and check if file input stream is not equals to null, and okay, leave this, then file input stream dot close. This IO exception will not happen now because the code which was trying to generate this IO exception has moved out of try block and it is residing in finally block. So we need to handle that. So while trying to close the file, I am using a small try catch block and I am handling this. So even if this line, these two, if there is some error in this try block, then the corresponding catch is going to execute, but there are some lines of code which are getting skipped. But apart from that, this finally block is going to be executed at all point of time. So suppose I want to just write something, I am in finally block. Okay, so let's look at the scenario. Once I'm going to execute this line, I'm going to find the file name should be there, and while executing this line I'm going to this is fine, then the second line is executed and the try block has executed properly, then the catch is not going to execute, but then also we are going to execute the finally block. In the second case, we are going to make the file name different so that the file is not present, and we are going to throw some exception from here. The creating the new file input stream is going to throw some exception. This line will not be executed. The corresponding catch block will execute. But after that also the finally block should execute. So let's run the code and look at the output. Now it says, hi Sanya, the file name it doesn't exist because this is the line which thrown the exception and we are into this catch block. It has printed, hi Sanya, the file does not exist. But after that the finally block is also executed. Look at the console. After that it says I am in finally block. So let's do one thing. Let's give this name names.txt. This file is actually present in our application, names.txt. So when running the code, this line will not throw any exception, right? This line will not throw any exception because the file is present. Then it will try to print the next line, file open for reading, and after successfully executing the entire try block, there is no error, so no catch block is executed and it will come to finally block. As I have told you, irrespective of exception which has occurred or not, it is always going to come to that finally block. So now the file is present, the file can be available, the file can be opened for reading, the file input stream object can be created. So let's run the code, right click, run as Java application. You can see again it says I am in finally block. So irrespective of the exception which occurs within the try block or the catch which handles the exception, the finally block is going to be executed at all point of time. Okay. Do you have any doubt?